There's a question nobody out west ever asked out loud, because asking it meant you already knew the answer, and knowing the answer meant you'd have to do something about it. The question was this: when does a lie become the truest thing you've ever lived? I've kept a logbook since I was 17. Not a diary, I want to be clear about that, because diaries are for people who believe their feelings deserve permanent record, and I was never that confident. A logbook. Dates, whether livestock counts, fence repairs. The occasional note when something strange happened on the range that I couldn't explain by morning light. I filled 3 logbooks watching Colt Delaney and Clara Whitmore try to convince the territory of New Mexico that they were a married couple. I filled a 4th one, watching them figure out they actually were. Here's what I didn't write down, because some things feel wrong to commit to paper, is that the lie was never the interesting part. The lie was just the door. What mattered was what they found on the other side of it. A life that neither of them had thought to want, built out of borrowed words and shared hardship, and the particular kind of trust that only grows in places where the ground keeps shifting under your feet. Colt Delaney was the most stubborn man I ever watched try to protect something he refused to admit he cared about. Clara Whitmore was the most determined woman I ever watched refuse to be rescued. Between the two of them, they built something that the territory's best lawyers and the county's most skeptical judge couldn't have untangled, because it wasn't made of paper. It was made of the kind of stuff that doesn't have a name in any document I ever logged. What follows is what I saw, what I heard, what I wrote in the margins when the facts weren't enough. I'll try to keep the editorializing to a minimum. I won't succeed. The first time I saw Clara Whitmore, she was standing in the middle of Delaney's yard with both fists clenched at her sides, a carpetbag at her feet, and the expression of a woman deciding whether to stay or run before anyone noticed she'd arrived. She'd arrived. I noticed. I was mending fence along the eastern pasture when the stage came through, which wasn't unusual. The Seco Springs stage ran twice weekly, and sometimes dropped passengers at the crossroads half a mile from Delaney's gate if they asked nicely and tipped the driver. What was unusual was that the woman who stepped off it was alone, unescorted, wearing a dress that was too good for ranch country and boots that were too worn for town. And she stood at the crossroads for a full 4 minutes. I counted, because I had my logbook open and nothing better to do, before she picked up her bag and walked toward the Delaney spread like she owned the approach if not yet the destination. I wrote unknown woman carpetbag indeterminate purpose. Watch. That was the 5th of April, 1887. The dry season had started early. The grass along the south pasture had already gone yellow, and Colt Delaney was 3 weeks from losing his ranch to a land claim dispute that the county surveyor and 2 circuit judges and a territorial representative named Aldous Vane had been engineering for the better part of a year. I didn't know any of that yet. I learned it in pieces, the way you learn most things out here, slowly, through overheard arguments and the particular silences that fall between men who know more than they're saying. What I knew that morning was that Delaney came out of his barn when he heard the gate, and the way he stopped walking told me the woman wasn't a stranger to him, but she also wasn't expected. That's a specific kind of stop. Most people, when they see someone unexpected, take a step back or a step forward. Delaney did neither. He went very still, the way a man goes still when he's calculating whether a situation is an opportunity or a problem and hasn't landed yet. She crossed the yard. She stopped 6 feet from him. She said something I couldn't hear from the fence line. He took off his hat, put it back on. That was Delaney's tell. I'd worked his cattle drives twice in 2 years, and I'd seen it. He took his hat off when something surprised him past his usual defenses, and put it back on when he'd decided to deal with it. I went back to mending fence, but I kept the logbook open. Her name was Clara Whitmore, and she had come from Santa Fe, and the story she told Delaney that first afternoon, which I heard in pieces over the following 3 days, because ranch life is small and voices carry, was this. Her brother, Thomas Whitmore, had borrowed $700 from Colt Delaney 2 years prior. Thomas Whitmore had subsequently died of a fever in the summer of '86, leaving no estate, no heirs, and one sister who'd spent the intervening 10 months trying to find a way to honor a debt she hadn't incurred. She'd come to work it off. That was her opening position. She could cook, manage accounts, mend, garden, nurse sick livestock. and had once helped a veterinarian outside Albuquerque set a horse's broken leg, which she offered as a credential with the same steady delivery she used for everything else she said. Delaney told her it wasn't necessary. She told him she hadn't asked his opinion on whether it was necessary. I wrote in my logbook, woman's name, Clara Whitmore, disposition determined, conflict potential significant. What none of us knew yet, what I pieced together over the following week from Delaney's ranch hand Amos, who had a gift for absorbing information from the general atmosphere the way dry wood absorbs moisture, was that the land dispute had reached a critical juncture. Aldous Vane, the territorial representative, had been systematically acquiring ranch land along the Rio Seco corridor for 3 years. He did it through a combination of legal maneuvering and social pressure that was difficult to name directly but impossible to miss if you lived in it. He challenged deed filings. He disputed survey lines. He cultivated relationships with the men who certified land claims and made sure those men understood where their continued employment lay. What he'd found in Delaney's case was a flaw in the original deed filing from 1879, a flaw that may or may not have been genuine, depending on who you believed, and the territory had an unfortunate tendency to believe whoever held the most political capital. The flaw pertained to a clause in the territorial land grant that required the claimant to be, in the language of 1879 legislation, a settler of established domestic household. A single man living alone could hold the deed provisionally. A married man, or a man who could demonstrate established domestic stability, held it outright. Delaney had held it provisionally for 8 years. Vane's lawyers had recently discovered this and were preparing to argue that provisional holding was insufficient to withstand a competing commercial claim. The hearing was scheduled for the 22nd of May, 6 weeks away. Amos told me this on a Thursday evening, sitting on an upturned bucket outside the bunkhouse, chewing on a piece of dried grass with the focused air of a man delivering news he considered monumental. "He needs a wife," Amos said, "on paper legal-like before the hearing." I looked toward the ranch house, where lamplight was visible through the kitchen window, and the silhouette of a woman moving around the interior was clear against the yellow glow. "Seems like he might have found one," I said. Amos nodded slowly. "Seems like she might have found him." I opened my logbook. I wrote, "The arrangement is not yet an arrangement, it will be." I wasn't there for the conversation that made it official. I've accepted that. Some things happen in rooms, and you only get the after effects, the changed quality of silence, the new geometry of how people hold themselves around each other. What I know is that on the 8th of April, 3 days after Clara arrived, Delaney drove into Seco Springs with her beside him on the wagon bench. They came back 4 hours later with a marriage certificate from Judge Harlan Mott, who was the kind of judge who asked the minimum necessary questions and charged a flat fee of $3 for the paperwork regardless of the circumstances, because he believed the paperwork was the legal act, and whatever the people involved felt about it was between them and their conscience. Clara had a plain gold band on her left hand that I later learned Delaney had bought from the dry goods store for 85 cents, because it was the only one in stock. She wore it like it had always been there. He drove the wagon like he was transporting something fragile. I wrote marriage recorded, arrangement begins, stakes 1 ranch, duration unknown. The problem with arrangements, as I've observed in 31 years of watching people navigate complicated situations, is that they require both parties to maintain a consistent understanding of what the arrangement actually is. The moment one party's understanding begins to drift toward something softer, something more complicated, something that doesn't fit neatly into the original terms, the arrangement develops structural faults that are invisible until they're not. I didn't write that in the logbook. I thought it, sitting on my upturned bucket that evening while Amos talked about weather and cattle prices, and I watched the light in the ranch house kitchen burn longer than it usually did. The first week of the arrangement was a study in careful performance. They were polite with each other the way people are polite when they're aware of being watched. Which they were. Amos watched everything. I watched most things, and the 2 ranch hands who came in for the spring branding, Deke and a man everyone called Curly because his hair was absolutely flat, had the territorial gossip network's gift for observation and distribution. Clara managed the house with a competence that was neither aggressive nor showy. She simply did things, and they got done. And the ranch house, which had been the particular kind of functional disaster that results from a man living alone for 8 years, began to develop the small indicators of care. Curtains beaten clean and rehung, the kitchen smell changing from burnt coffee and leather to something that occasionally included actual food. The front step repaired with new wood that Delaney had cut, and Clara had asked him to cut without making it a request for a favor. Delaney kept a careful distance. I noticed the geometry of it, how he'd cross a room to the far side before he needed something from the near side, how he'd wait until she'd left the porch before he sat in his chair, how conversation between them at the end of the day had the quality of two people conducting a business meeting in a language neither of them had studied. It wasn't unfriendly, it was careful. There's a difference, though it's subtle. On the 4th day, she asked him about the ranch. Not the deed dispute, that conversation came later. She asked about the land itself. How many head of cattle, what the grass situation was on the south pasture, what his rotation schedule looked like, whether the well on the northwest corner still ran clean in August. He told me later, this was weeks later, during a fence ride when conversation sometimes happens simply because the silence gets long enough to need filling, that he hadn't expected the questions to be real questions. He'd expected politeness, the performance of interest. But she listened to his answers the way someone listens when they're filing information for future use, and she asked follow-up questions that demonstrated she'd absorbed what he'd said. She knows cattle, he told me, looking at the middle distance in the way he looked at things when they'd caught him off guard. Where'd she learn? Her father had a small operation outside Albuquerque before he died. He paused. Before Thomas died. Another pause. Before a lot of things died. I didn't write any of that in the logbook. Some things don't belong in the log. But I held on to it, the way you hold onto the specific gravity of a sentence when you know it's going to matter later. The first real crack in the careful politeness happened on the 14th of April, 9 days into the arrangement. I was in the barn, not eavesdropping, I want to be clear about this, but engaged in the entirely legitimate task of checking the shoe on a horse that had been favoring its left foreleg since Tuesday. The barn shared a wall with the tack room, and the tack room's window was open because it was warm. Delaney and Clara were in the tack room. I didn't know that until the conversation was already happening. The lease on the North Range, she said. You let it lapse. It expired. You let it expire, there's a difference. A silence, then I know. That grazing land is worth. I know what it's worth. Then why, she stopped. When she spoke again, her voice had changed quality, lower, more careful. Was it a money problem before the dispute started? Was that already happening? He didn't answer immediately. The horse shifted under my hands. I kept working. Land's expensive to maintain when you're the only one maintaining it, he said finally. Some things slip. What else slipped? Another silence, longer. The south fence, the pump on the secondary well. 3 contracts I should have renewed in '85 that I let go because I couldn't, because I needed the capital for the cattle purchase, and I chose the cattle. A pause. I chose wrong. You chose what made sense at the time. I chose what I thought made sense. That's different. I focused very carefully on the horse's shoe. The mare was cooperative and did not require the level of attention I was giving her. I'm good with accounts, Clara said. I worked my father's books until he died, and then I worked a hotel's books in Santa Fe for 14 months. I can see where the problems are if you'll show me the ledger. You don't need to. Colt, her voice had something in it I couldn't name. Firmness, but not anger. The kind of firmness that comes from having decided something and not being willing to relitigate the decision. I am here. I am going to be here through the hearing. While I'm here, I am going to be useful. Let me look at the ledger. A very long silence. All right, he said. I wrote in my logbook that night. She is repairing things, he is letting her. I didn't write down that the way he'd said all right had the quality of a man setting down something heavy he'd been carrying alone for a long time. I didn't write it because I couldn't find the right words, and I've never put something in the log that I couldn't find the right words for. But I thought about it for a long time before I slept. The pretense required external performance, and the first significant test came on the 17th of April when the Haverty family came to call. The Haverdys were neighbors. Their land ran along Delaney's western border, and Alina Haverdy was the territory's most reliable social information network, a woman who collected facts about her neighbors with the systematic joy of a naturalist cataloging species. She arrived with her husband Gerald and their daughter Bess, and a jar of preserved peaches, which was the standard currency of neighborly goodwill, and which also functioned as the price of admission to whatever information she'd come to collect. I was up on the roof of the barn when they came, replacing a section of shingles that had started to leak in February. I had a clear sight line to the front porch, and nothing between me and the sound of voices, but 30 feet of warm April air. Clara met them at the gate. I watched the moment Alina Haverdy saw her, the brief recalibration, the slight widening of eyes, the rapid assessment that took in Clara's dress, her posture, the plain gold band on her left hand. And I watched Clara receive this assessment without flinching, without smiling too quickly or explaining too much, the two things that announce performance. "Mrs. Delaney," Alina said, as if testing the sound of it. "Mrs. Haverdy," Clara said, as if it were simply true. They shook hands. Delaney appeared from the barn. He'd seen the Haverdy wagon coming and had done something I noted and logged later, which was that he'd stopped, straightened, and walked toward the house with a deliberate ease that was designed to look like unconscious ease. He was performing comfort. He was not entirely comfortable. But here is the thing I watched from the roof, shingles forgotten. When he reached the porch and stood beside Clara, something in his posture changed. Not a conscious adjustment, or not entirely. He stood slightly closer than the careful distance he'd maintained all week, not touching, just closer, and she didn't move away. Alina Haverdy watched them the way she watched everything, bright-eyed and comprehensive. "We heard you'd married," she said to Delaney. "Quiet ceremony." "We're private people," Clara said, which was neither a lie nor the truth and was the best possible answer to the question. Of course you are," Alina smiled. "We're so pleased for you both." I wrote that evening, external performance successful. Note, his proximity to her was not performance, or not entirely. I sat with that note for a while before I moved on. The ledger work happened over 3 evenings at the kitchen table. I know because Amos, whose bunkhouse window faced the kitchen, mentioned the lamplight burning late, and because on the 4th day Clara appeared at breakfast with a list of figures written on the back of an envelope that she put in front of Delaney without preamble. 3 areas, she said. The lapsed North Range lease. We should try to recover that before the hearing because it strengthens your operational claim on the land. The Mercer contract, that can be renegotiated, he's got no one else for that corridor. And the water rights on the East Creek. That one's going to be harder. Delaney looked at the list. He looked at her. He looked at the list again. "You did this last night. And the night before, I told you I was good with accounts. I thought that was..." "What?" He picked up the list, set it down, picked it up again. "Politeness," he said. She looked at him with an expression I was told about later by Amos, who had, in fact, been watching through the window with a subtlety he greatly overestimated. "I don't do politeness," she said. "I do things." Amos reported that Delaney had looked at her for a long moment, then looked back at the list and said, "We'll go to the Mercer place Thursday," and that she'd nodded and poured coffee, and that had been the end of it. I wrote, "The arrangement is developing subtext. Proceed with attention." What I meant was, something is shifting. I could feel it the way you feel weather changing, not the rain itself, but the quality of the air before the rain, the particular pressure that means something is coming, and you should decide now whether you're going inside or staying out. The question of what they said to each other in the evenings, after the work was done and the ranch hands were in the bunkhouse, and the lamp was burning on the kitchen table, and it was just the two of them in the house they were pretending was a home. I never answered that question directly. Some things deserve the privacy of closed doors. What I have is evidence of effect. By the end of April, 3 weeks into the arrangement, something had changed in the architecture of how they occupied shared space. The careful distance had compressed. Not dramatically. This wasn't a sudden warmth, and I want to be precise about that, because precision matters more than sentiment in a logbook, but the margins had narrowed. He brought her coffee before she asked for it, which required him to know when she wanted it, which required him to have been watching when he thought no one noticed. She fixed his collar before they went to town, a quick 2-second adjustment, and neither of them acknowledged it, which was more intimate than if they'd made something of it. When a problem came up with the south pasture fence, a long section down after a wind storm, 30 head of cattle loose, she was in the saddle alongside him before he'd finished assessing the situation. She rode like someone who'd spent time on horseback and made no performance of it. They worked the cattle back together in a silence that had the quality of practiced partnership rather than careful arrangement. I was there for that. I helped with the fence. At one point, near the end of the afternoon, with the last section of fence repaired and the cattle accounted for, Delaney looked at her across the post they were both holding steady and said something that I was close enough to hear. "You didn't have to do this." She looked at him steadily. Her hair had come loose on one side and she hadn't bothered with it. There was dust on her face and a cut on her left hand from the wire, wrapped in a strip of cloth she'd torn from her handkerchief. "I know that," she said. "That was all. I wrote that night in the margin of my logbook, where I put things that don't fit in the regular columns. When does a lie become the truest thing you've ever lived?" I'd been carrying that question since, before the story started. I was beginning to think I knew where the answer lived. It lived in a 2-second collar adjustment, a cup of coffee brought before it was asked for, a woman riding toward a broken fence before a man had finished deciding it needed riding toward. The arrangement was real in every way that mattered. Neither of them had said so yet. That would come later, with considerably more difficulty. On the 28th of April, a writer came from town with a letter bearing the seal of the Territorial Land Office. Aldous Vane had filed a formal challenge to the marriage certificate, on the grounds that it had been obtained under expedient circumstances and did not reflect genuine domestic establishment. He was requesting that the circuit judge order an inquiry before the hearing date. Delaney came and found me at the south pasture. He had the letter in his hand, and he held it the way men hold things they'd like to destroy, but know better than to. "He's going to send someone," he said, "to look at the property, to talk to people." He paused to talk to her. I looked at him. He was looking at the grass. "Colt," I said carefully. "Don't. I wasn't going to say anything. You were going to say something about the arrangement. I was going to say that Clara seems like someone who can handle a conversation with a territorial investigator." He was quiet for a moment. "She can," he said. "That's not what I'm worried about." I waited. "What I'm worried about," he said, "is that she's going to have to say things in that conversation that aren't." He stopped. Started again. "Things that she signed on to pretend, that she'll have to pretend harder with a stranger asking direct questions, and I don't know if that's." He stopped again. "Colt, what have you told her?" "About the investigator? Not yet." "About the other thing?" He put his hat on. He'd had it off already. I hadn't noticed him take it off, which meant the surprise had hit him somewhere before the conversation started. He put it back on and looked at the far pasture. "There's no other thing," he said. I wrote in my logbook that night just one line. "There is an other thing." Theodore Marsh arrived on the 3rd of May on a gray gelding that looked like it had made the journey from Santa Fe, with the resigned dignity of a horse that had given up expecting consideration. Marsh himself was a compact man in his mid-50s, with a neat brown coat and the kind of eyes that held still even when the rest of his face was in motion, the eyes of someone trained to note the gap between what people said and how their bodies arranged themselves around the saying of it. He worked for the Territorial Land Office and had, I learned later, done this kind of inquiry 14 times in 5 years. He'd found genuine fraud in 3 cases and legitimate marriage in 11. He introduced himself at the gate. Delaney shook his hand. Clara, who had come out of the house when she heard hooves on the approach road, shook his hand also. She'd been making bread. There was flour on her left sleeve, and she didn't brush it off or apologize for it. Just shook his hand like flour on a sleeve was a normal condition for a woman on a working ranch, which it was. I was fixing the hinge on the barn door, close enough to observe, far enough to be plausibly uninterested. "Mrs. Delaney," Marsh said, shaking her hand. "Mr. Marsh." She looked at him without the bright social anxiety that comes from a person who's been caught doing something. She looked at him the way you look at a man whose visit you've been expecting and prepared for. "I've set coffee and I've taken the bread out of the oven. Come inside." I glanced at Delaney. His expression was controlled, but not entirely. There was something behind his eyes that I'd started recognizing in the past 2 weeks, a quality of careful attention that was specifically directed at Clara, the way you pay attention to something you're afraid of losing. He followed them inside, the door closed. I focused on the hinge, I worked slowly. Marsh spent 3 days at the ranch. His methods were methodical and thorough without being aggressive. He interviewed each of the ranch hands separately, asked questions that ranged from the practical, sleeping arrangements, work schedules, property management, to the personal, how long they'd known Delaney, when they'd first heard about the marriage, whether the arrangement of the household seemed consistent with established domestic life. Amos handled his interview with the serene confidence of a man who had been telling partial truths all his life, and had long since made peace with the distinction between lying and not volunteering. He talked about Clara's competence with the accounts, the improved state of the kitchen, the fact that she'd correctly diagnosed a case of wire sickness in 2 of the cattle before Delaney had noticed, and how she rode alongside him like she'd been doing it for years. Deke, whose loyalty was uncomplicated because his nature was uncomplicated, said that Mrs. Delaney was the best thing that happened to the Delaney spread since he'd started working it 2 years back, and offered this assessment with such genuine conviction that Marsh had written something in his notes. Curly, bless him, mostly talked about the bread. I was interviewed on the morning of the 2nd day, sitting in the kitchen across from Marsh, while Clara was in the yard and Delaney was out on the range. Marsh set a small ledger on the table and looked at me with those still eyes. "You've known Mr. Delaney for some time," he said. "2 cattle drives. I've been working his spring fence repair for about 3 weeks. And you've observed the household. Hard not to on a ranch this size. What's your impression of the marriage?" I looked at him, he looked at me. I thought about what I'd seen and what I'd written and what I'd kept in the margin instead. "Complicated," I said. His eyebrows moved slightly. "In what sense?" "In the sense that most real things are complicated and most fake things are simple. Simple is easy to maintain. They're not maintaining something simple." He wrote something. "What are they maintaining?" he asked. I thought about 2 people on either side of a fence post, holding it steady, dust on a face, a collar adjusted in 2 seconds that neither person mentioned. "Something they're still figuring out how to name," I said, "which, in my experience, is the most reliable sign that it's real." He wrote something more. I didn't ask what. The interview that mattered, the one I heard about in parts, assembled like a broken piece of equipment that you have to figure out from the components, was Marsh's extended conversation with Clara on the afternoon of the 2nd day. She'd known it was coming. She'd told Delaney the night before, I know because Amos heard them on the porch, voices low but carrying in the particular stillness of late-evening ranch air, that she was ready for it and he should stop looking at her like she needed protecting. He'd said something she hadn't answered. Amos didn't catch the words, but he said it quietly, and she'd been quiet after it for a moment before she said, I know that." And then the porch had gone silent, and eventually the lamp inside had gone dark. I put that scene in my logbook several times, trying different words for what Amos described, and I've never gotten it right. So I've left it at the facts: quiet voices, a particular silence, a lamp going dark. What I have from the Marsh interview is Clara's account, given to me 2 days later with the matter-of-fact precision she brought to all accounts, while we were both waiting for Delaney to bring the wagon around to go into town. Marsh had asked her why she'd married a man she'd apparently barely known. She'd told him about Thomas, about the debt, about deciding that if she was going to make a life somewhere, it might as well be somewhere she owed something to, because at least that gave the life a place to start. Marsh had asked if she loved her husband. She'd been quiet for a moment. "That's a strange question," she'd said. "Most people assume it." "Mr. Vane's lawyers don't assume it," Marsh had told her. "Mr. Vane's lawyers can walk into the south pasture and get a closer look at what I think of their assumptions," she'd said. Marsh, apparently, had found this answer more useful than a direct one. He'd written something and moved to his next question. But the question had snagged in her, the way a question sometimes does when you're not prepared for it, not because it's difficult, but because it's pointing at something you've been deliberately not looking at. She told me this without excessive elaboration. Clara didn't do excessive elaboration. But she told me, which meant she was working something out by saying it, which is what people do when they haven't said it to the person they most need to say it to yet. He asked if I loved him, she said, looking at the gate and not at me. And I started to give the answer I'd prepared, which was the kind of answer that contains truth and also contains a reasonable amount of strategic vagueness. And then, she paused. The wagon was coming down the far lane. And then I didn't. What did you say instead? She watched the wagon. Delaney was up on the bench, handling the reins with the easy competence of a man who'd done it 10,000 times. I said, I'm beginning to understand what I feel, and I'm not sure the timeline is the most important thing about it. I opened my logbook. I didn't write anything. I just held it open, because sometimes you hold the logbook open not to record, but to anchor yourself in a moment you don't want to lose. Was that true? I asked. She looked at me. Her expression was the particular kind of composed that requires effort. That's a strange question, she said. She walked toward the wagon. Marsh left on the morning of the 4th day. He shook Delaney's hand at the gate and Clara's hand also, and said he would submit his report to the Territorial Land Office before the end of the week. He gave no indication of his findings. His face was entirely neutral in the way of a man who trained himself to reveal nothing before the official moment of revelation. The wagon disappeared down the approach road. Delaney and Clara stood at the gate for a moment. I was 20 yards away, not trying to hide it. Well, Delaney said. Well, Clara said. You did, he stopped, whatever you told him. I told him the truth, she said. He looked at her. As much of it as I know, she added, quieter. The quality of the air changed. It was the pressure before rain thing again, that atmospheric shift that announces itself before it announces itself. I watched Delaney look at her, and I watched her look back, and I watched something move across both their faces that neither of them was prepared to make into words yet. He reached out and touched her hand. Quick, barely a second, not a romantic gesture in any theatrical sense, more like the kind of touch that says, I know, I'm here, I see what you just did and I see what it cost you. She didn't pull away. He let go. They walked back to the ranch house without talking, but the silence between them had changed quality. It wasn't the careful silence of the first weeks. It was the complicated silence of two people carrying the same weight and having recently, without explicitly agreeing to it, started carrying it together. I wrote something has been said without being said. Note the date. The date was the 7th of May, 1887. Two things happened in the 10 days between Marsh's departure and the hearing. The first, the Mercer contract. Delaney and Clara had gone to the Mercer ranch on a Thursday, as discussed. Benjamin Mercer was a blunt, practical man who ran a mid-sized cattle operation to the north and had previously contracted with Delaney for grazing corridor access. The contract had lapsed. Clara's ledger work had confirmed this was a real loss, not just a missed opportunity. I heard about the meeting from Delaney, who told me about it with the slightly off-balance quality of a man recounting something he wasn't sure how to categorize. Mercer had been resistant. His position was that the lapsed contract was a breach of reliability, and reliability was the currency he dealt in. He'd found other arrangements and was disinclined to revisit. Clara had sat across from him at his kitchen table and laid out 3 years of comparable grazing data from comparable properties along the corridor and demonstrated, with the patient specificity of someone who'd done the arithmetic twice, that his current arrangements were costing him more per head per week than a renegotiated Delaney contract would, and that the apparent savings were an artifact of front-loaded fee structures that would normalize upward at the 12-month mark. Mercer had looked at the figures. He'd looked at Delaney. He'd looked at Clara. "This your wife's idea?" he'd asked. "My wife's analysis," Delaney had said. Mercer had looked at the figures again. "What's her margin of error on the 12-month projection?" "Ask her," Delaney had said. Clara had told him the margin of error and explained the two variables most likely to affect it and how she'd weighted them. Mercer had listened. He'd asked 2 more questions. Then he'd said he'd have his man draw up new terms by Friday. Delaney told me this on the ride back from the North Pasture, and when he finished the account he was quiet for a moment and then said, "She didn't wait for me to speak. She just did the thing," I said. "Knew what the thing was and did it." He shook his head slightly. I've been to Mercer 4 times trying to get that contract back, 4 times. Different this time. He looked at the horizon. Different, he agreed. I didn't press what was different. We both knew what was different, and saying it felt like the kind of thing that belonged to him, not to the logbook. The second thing, the North Range lease. This one was harder. The North Range had been leased from a widow named Harriet Dunmore, whose late husband had held the grazing rights on a parcel that abutted Delaney's northeast corner. When the lease lapsed, Harriet had been approached by Aldous Vane's people, who'd offered her a purchase price for the grazing rights that was fair by the standards of someone who didn't know what the land was actually worth as part of the larger corridor that Vane was assembling. Clara found this out through Alina Haverty, whose social information network extended in directions Alina herself sometimes found surprising. The news came on a Wednesday afternoon, delivered with preserved plum jam and the careful sympathy of a woman who enjoyed delivering difficult information, but preferred to do it gently. I was on the porch when Alina left. Clara came out of the house with the same two-fists-clenched-at-sides posture I'd seen the first day she arrived, except this time it wasn't indecision. It was controlled anger. Delaney was in the barn. She went to the barn. I stayed on the porch and did not follow, which was the correct decision. Amos was in the barn. He reported that she'd told Delaney about the Dunmore situation in 3 sentences, precisely and without dramatics, and that he'd listened with his hat in his hands, which by now I knew was his tell for something past his usual defenses. Then she'd said, "I want to go see her." Harriet Dunmore. Before Vane's people closed the deal. Clara, I know what you're going to say. Do you? You're going to say it's probably too late and we shouldn't get our hopes up, and the smart thing is to focus on what we can still affect. A silence. That's not what I was going to say, he said. Amos said the quality of the silence that followed was different from the usual silences. What were you going to say? She asked. I was going to say I'll hitch the wagon. I don't know what they said to Harriet Dunmore. They went alone without me, which was right. What I know is that they came back 4 hours later, and Clara went directly into the house and was in there for a long time. And when she came out, her eyes were clear, but her hands were careful. The way hands are careful when you've been doing something with them that required concentration, which I came to understand was needlework, her version of working through something, a fact I'd observed once before when she'd had a difficult account to reconcile. Delaney told me the next morning. Harriet Dunmore had already signed a letter of intent with Vane's representative. It wasn't a final contract, but breaking a letter of intent was a social act as much as a legal one, and Harriet Dunmore was a woman who didn't break her word. Clara had known this when they left. She'd gone anyway, because some situations deserve to be faced even when you can't change the outcome, because the facing itself is the thing that lets you live with whatever comes next. What Clara had done instead of trying to reverse the Dunmore decision was sit with Harriet for 2 hours and listen to her. Actually listen, not strategically, just with the full attention of someone who understood that an older woman alone on a property, selling off what her husband had built, might need more than a counteroffer. She talked to her about the land, about Thomas, about coming to the Delaney ranch, and what she'd found there. Harriet Dunmore had not rescinded the letter of intent. But she had, at the end of the conversation, told Clara something that Delaney reported to me with the careful precision of a man who'd been thinking about it since it was said. She told Clara that she hadn't known before meeting her that Colt Delaney had any sense at all, and that if she'd known he had sense enough to, and this is the part she said exactly, find someone worth the finding, she might have waited to see what developed before signing anything. He stopped. We were riding the north fence line. The grass was yellow on one side of the fence and slightly less yellow on the other. Might have, I said. Might have, he agreed. We rode in silence for a while. Colt, I said eventually. Don't. I wasn't going to say anything except, the hearing is in a week. I know. And whatever happens at the hearing, the thing before the hearing. I said don't. I stopped, we rode. Then from him, quieter than I expected. I know it's not. I know what it started as. He was looking at the fence line. I don't know when it stopped being that. I took out my logbook. I wrote in the margin where the things that don't fit go. He knows when, he just hasn't said it yet. I knew when too. I'd been there. Dust on a face, wire cut wrapped in handkerchief cloth, a 2-second moment on either side of a fence post when nobody said anything because nothing needed saying. But the saying still needed to happen. It would happen before the hearing or after it, or in the middle of something that required more courage than either of them had thought they possessed. It would happen. I was certain of this in the way I'm certain of very few things. Not from evidence, but from the particular gravity of two people who have been carrying the same weight long enough that they've stopped being able to tell which parts of the weight are theirs. 3 days before the hearing, Aldous Vane came to the ranch himself. He came without warning, which was the point of coming without warning. He arrived mid-morning when Delaney was in the far pasture and Amos, and the hands were on the north fence, and I was in the barn with a horse that had developed a cough I was monitoring. It was Clara who met him at the gate. I know what happened because I heard it from the barn doorway, and because Clara told me afterward, and because I verified the details with Curly, who had been returning from the well with a bucket, and had witnessed the whole thing from behind the fence post with the dedicated stillness of a man who decided the bucket could wait. Vane was a large man with the kind of physical presence that had probably always done work for him socially, not aggressive, but substantial. The kind of substantial that suggests resources and confidence and the expectation of deference. He came with one man, a lawyer named Pritch, and he stood at the gate and asked to speak with Mr. Delaney. "My husband is on the range," Clara told him. "Is there something I can help you with?" Vane looked at her with the kind of look that contains an assessment and a dismissal in rapid succession. "I'll wait," he said. "That might be a long wait," Clara said pleasantly. "Come inside and have coffee." The offer was calibrated. Refusing it would look churlish. Accepting it meant sitting across a table from a woman he'd underestimated on her ground, on her terms. He accepted it. What happened at the kitchen table was, by all accounts, one of the more remarkable conversations that kitchen table ever hosted. Vane, over coffee he didn't touch, told Clara that the land dispute was a legal matter and that the marriage certificate, however sincerely obtained, did not change the underlying questions about the deed filing. He was civil about it. He was the kind of civil that contains a threat the way water contains cold. You don't see it until you're in it. Clara poured more coffee she hadn't asked if he wanted. Then she told him, with the same patient specificity she'd brought to the Mercer contract analysis, that she'd reviewed the original 1879 deed filing, the relevant territorial land grant language, and the 3 precedent cases in New Mexico territory that Vane's lawyers were likely relying on for their argument that established domestic household required continuous residence. She told him that the first precedent case, Harmon v. Territorial Land Commission, had a factual distinction that his lawyers may have missed, which was that the Harmon claim had been challenged within 12 months of the original filing, whereas Delaney's provisional status had been unchallenged for 8 years, which under the doctrine of equitable estoppel, she used those words precisely, created a very different legal landscape. Vane's lawyer, Pritch, looked up from his coffee. She told him that the second precedent case was stronger for his position, but relied on a surveyor certification that had subsequently been found to contain errors. She had the reference in a letter from a Santa Fe attorney she'd contacted the previous week, and that if Pritch attempted to rely on it at the hearing, the other side would have the error documentation. Pritch looked at Vane. Vane looked at Clara. Clara smiled pleasantly and asked if they'd like more coffee. "Where did you learn law?" Vane asked. "I worked in a hotel in Santa Fe," she said. "The lawyer who kept a room there liked to talk. I liked to listen." There was a silence. "The hearing is still proceeding," Vane said. "Of course it is," Clara said. "I wouldn't expect otherwise. I just wanted to make sure we'd had a chance to get acquainted before it did." She stood. "I'll tell my husband you called." They left. Curly, from behind the fence post, watched them go with the expression of a man who had witnessed something significant and was trying to find appropriate language. "Huh," was what he landed on. "I wrote in my logbook, she prepared for him. She prepared for everything. She is not pretending." Then I wrote underneath it, because the logbook deserved the honest version. "She stopped pretending a long time ago. The question is whether she knows that Colt knows. The hearing was in 3 days. Some things are decided before they're decided. I was beginning to understand that. The morning of the hearing, I found Delaney at the west fence before first light. This wasn't unusual in itself. He was a man who processed difficulty by doing something physical with his hands, and the fence was always in need of some attention. But the light was barely gray, and he'd been out there for a while before I arrived, which told me he'd woken early or hadn't slept. I didn't ask which. I picked up the spare wire cutters and worked the section beside him. We did about 40 feet of fence before he said anything. She sat up going through those precedent cases, he said. Until past midnight, I told her to sleep. What'd she say? That she'd sleep when she was ready to sleep. He clipped a wire end and folded it over. Then she made me go to bed. I kept my eyes on the fence. Like a wife, I said. He was quiet for so long, I thought he wasn't going to respond. Yeah, he said, like a wife. More fence. The light was getting gray-blue, the kind of early morning blue that makes the world look like it's trying to remember what color it is. Colt, I know. You don't know what I was going to say. You were going to say whatever it is you've been not saying for 3 weeks. I looked at him, he was looking at the fence. Then say it yourself, I told him. You don't need me for it. He was quiet, he clipped another wire. He held the end in his hand for a moment and then set it down on the post. It's not going to be easier, he said, because we won the hearing if we win the hearing. It's not going to be, he stopped. She came here to pay off a debt she didn't come here to. Colt, has she stayed in the room she arrived in? He looked at me. Since week 2, I said. Has she been anywhere in this house that a woman stays when she's paying off a debt? Or has she been in every part of it, including the parts that are hard and the parts that needed fixing and the parts that you'd given up on? He looked at his hands, at the fence, at the sky that was getting lighter. She might feel obligated, he said. Because of Thomas, because of the arrangement, she might feel like she has to. Clara Whitmore, I said, with perhaps more emphasis than I usually deployed, does not do anything because she feels obligated to. You know that. He put his hat on. Then he took it off, then he put it back on. I know, he said quietly. God help me, I know. We finished the fence. By the time we walked back to the ranch house, the lamp was already lit in the kitchen, and the smell of coffee was coming through the open window. And there was a woman inside who had spent the previous night studying law books, so that the man whose ranch she'd come to work for, come to live with, come to build alongside, would have every possible advantage in a hearing that would determine whether he kept his land. I stopped at the barn door. Go in, I said. He looked at me. Go in, I said again. Before the hearing, before everything gets official and complicated and there are other people present. Go in and say it. He stood at the barn door for a long moment. The light was full gold now, the kind of morning light that makes everything look like it's been chosen deliberately. He went in. I stayed in the barn for 30 minutes, checking the horse with the cough, who was improving. I didn't write anything in the logbook. Some things don't get written. We drove to Seco Springs for the hearing at 8:30. Delaney handled the reins. Clara sat beside him. I was in the back with Amos. Deke and Curly rode alongside on horseback because they'd decided without being asked that this was the kind of occasion that warranted a full turnout. Nobody talked much on the way in. The sky was clear and very blue. The road was dry, and the wagon made its particular sound on the packed earth, a rhythm that you stop hearing after a while and only notice again when something else changes. At one point, somewhere around the 2nd mile, I saw Clara's hand move. It was a small movement. She moved her hand from her lap to the space between herself and Delaney on the bench and left it there, not reaching for his hand, just placing it where it was available. He looked at the road ahead. He looked at her hand. He moved his own hand and covered it. Neither of them said anything. Amos, beside me in the wagon bed, looked away with the deliberate discretion of a man who'd seen something he was choosing to respect. I opened my logbook. I wrote, they have found the words, they haven't needed to speak them. Circuit Judge Carlton Hess was a thin man with a neat white beard and the compressed authority of someone who'd run courts in disputed territories for 20 years. and had long since stopped being surprised by anything that came before him. His courtroom was the main room of the Seco Springs courthouse, which was also used for town meetings, and on one occasion I'd been told about, a funeral when the ground was too frozen to dig. The room held perhaps 40 people when we arrived. The Haverty family was there. Benjamin Mercer was there. A number of ranchers from the corridor, some of whom I recognized, and some of whom had the particular stillness of people who'd come to watch a thing that might affect their own situations. Aldous Vane was there with 3 lawyers, including Pritch, who had the expression of a man who'd spent the last 3 days doing research he'd rather not have done. Clara sat beside Delaney at the respondents' table. She'd worn her good dress, the one she'd arrived in, and the plain gold band was on her left hand where it had been since the 8th of April. She held the ledger of precedent cases and her notes in a leather satchel she'd borrowed from Delaney's study. She looked, I want to find the right word for this, and I've tried several. She looked like someone who lived there, who had always been going to be there, at this table, with this man, in this specific fight, as if the whole history of her life had been organizing itself toward this room. I don't know if she felt that. I know that's what it looked like. Judge Hess opened the proceedings. Vane's lead lawyer, a man named Garrett with impressive whiskers and an impressive voice, made the opening argument for the challenge. He was thorough and precise. He cited the 3 precedent cases. He raised the question of the expedient marriage certificate. He questioned whether a marriage of 6 weeks, he said 6 weeks with a specific weight, could constitute established domestic household under the meaning of the 1879 grant language. Judge Hess listened with his hands folded, and his eyes focused on the space slightly above the speaker's head, which I'd been told was his habit when he was actually listening most carefully. Delaney's lawyer, a man named Briggs who was older and less impressive-looking than Garrett, but had the advantage of being good, presented the counterargument. The 8 years of provisional holding, the equitable estoppel doctrine, the character references from the ranch hands from Alina Haverty, who had submitted a written statement, God bless her, from Benjamin Mercer, from 3 other ranchers along the corridor. Then Garrett raised the Harmon case. Clara, beside Delaney, opened the leather satchel and took out a single sheet of paper and passed it quietly to Briggs without looking at him. Briggs received it, he read it, he looked at Clara briefly, he stood up. Your Honor, in response to the Harmon precedent, I have here a letter from the Santa Fe Office of Record regarding a factual distinction that the opposing counsel may not have noted in their research. The next 40 minutes were technical and involved considerable cross-reference to territorial statutes that I followed approximately 30% of, and Amos, beside me, followed 0% of, but watched with the fascinated attention of a man watching something important happen in a language he doesn't speak. When it was done, Judge Hess unfolded his hands. He looked at the room. He looked at the lawyers. He looked briefly at Vane, who had not moved during the proceedings and had the expression of a man recalculating. I've heard the arguments, Judge Hess said, and I've read the submitted materials. A pause. The legal questions regarding the 1879 deed language are not in themselves sufficient to overturn 8 years of provisional holding without substantially stronger evidence of procedural irregularity in the original filing, which has not been demonstrated. Another pause. The challenge to the marriage certificate on grounds of expedient circumstances is not a legal standard this court recognizes. Expedience has never disqualified a legal act under territorial law, and I do not intend to set that precedent today. He looked at the room for a moment. The Delaney deed stands. This hearing is closed. The room did several things at once. Mercer stood up. The Havertys looked at each other. Vane's lawyers collected their papers with the compressed efficiency of men who knew when to leave quickly. Clara sat very still for a moment. Then Delaney's hand found her hand under the table. I saw it from the row behind, his hand covering hers, the same gesture as the wagon bench, but different now because the context had changed. Because the weight they'd been carrying together had been formally set down, and what remained was just themselves, and whatever they'd become in 6 weeks of fighting for a piece of land that was really a fight for something much harder to name. She turned her hand over so she was holding his back. Briggs was shaking their hands. Mercer was crossing the room. Alina Haverty was 3 people away from hugging Clara, which she accomplished 30 seconds later with the enthusiastic commitment of someone who'd been waiting for it. Amos, beside me, said, "Huh." with exactly the same intonation as Curly had used 3 days ago, which made me think it was the correct response to things that turned out the way you hoped, but were bigger than you'd let yourself believe they would be. I took out my logbook. I held my pen over the page for a moment. I wrote deed stands, so does everything else. We ate at the Seco Springs Hotel restaurant that evening, all of us. Amos and Deke and Curly and Mercer and his wife and the Haverdys and Briggs and his clerk. 15 people around pushed-together tables in a room that smelled of beef stew and candle smoke, and the specific warmth of people who'd survived something together. Delaney bought a bottle of whiskey for the table, which was not his habit, and toasted in the spare and slightly uncomfortable way of a man who'd been asked to speak publicly and has decided the best approach is brevity. To the Delaney spread, he said, and the people who showed up for it. He looked at Clara when he said it. She looked back at him. Nobody at the table seemed to require elaboration. After dinner, when people were drifting toward their wagons and the evening was getting cool, and the sky had gone the particular dark blue that means stars are considering appearing, I found myself outside on the hotel's front step with the logbook on my knee and a lamp burning on the post beside me. Clara came out. She had her shawl around her shoulders and she was still wearing the plain gold band, and she stood on the step for a moment, looking at the street before she noticed me. "Writing something?" she asked. "Trying to." She came and sat on the step beside me, not looking at the logbook, just sitting. "He told me," she said after a moment, "this morning before we left." I didn't ask what he'd told her. I knew what he'd told her. And I said. She looked at the street. A lantern was swinging somewhere in the wind, making the shadows move. "And I told him that I'd known for 3 weeks," she said, "and that I'd been waiting for him to catch up." I looked at her. She was almost smiling, but it was the kind of almost smile that contains things that aren't quite amusement, things more serious and more permanent. "How'd he take that?" I asked. "He laughed," she said. "He almost never laughs. It was," she paused. "It was good, it was." Another pause, and this time I waited it out. "It was like finding out the house you've been living in is actually yours, not on paper, in the way that makes the paper unnecessary because you already know." I looked down at the logbook. She stood, she pulled her shawl closer. "I'm going back inside," she said. "He's looking for me." "I know." She went. The door opened, and the warm light and noise from the restaurant came out briefly, and then the door closed. I sat on the step for a long time. The stars had decided to appear. The lantern was still swinging somewhere in the dark, its light moving across the dusty street in a slow, unsteady rhythm. I wrote in the logbook, not in the regular columns, not in the margin, but directly in the middle of the page, where I never wrote anything, because it felt like the kind of thing that deserved the center. When does a lie become the truest thing you've ever lived? When you stop needing to maintain it. When it becomes the truth on its own, without your help, without your performance, without anything except the ordinary accumulation of days in which 2 people chose each other without exactly meaning to, and then looked up one morning and found they had. I closed the logbook. The lantern swung, the stars held. Inside the restaurant, through the thin wall, I could hear voices and laughter, and the sound of 15 people who'd had a good day settling into the good part of a good evening. I heard once above the general warmth of it, a laugh that was lower and less frequent than the others, and then a voice I recognized saying something I couldn't make out, and then a brief, warm quiet. I didn't write it down. Some things don't go in the log. I just sat with it for a while, on a hotel step in Seco Springs, New Mexico, on the 22nd of May, 1887, while the stars came out one at a time and the lantern kept its slow, uncertain swing, and somewhere inside, a man who'd needed a pretend wife was finding out what he actually needed, and a woman who'd come to pay off a debt was realizing she'd been given something entirely different in return. I didn't know that evening how the next year would go, or the 10 years after that. I didn't know what Vane would try next, or what the territory would become, or what the ranch would look like in 1900 when things were different everywhere.